History has a way of smoothing over the jagged edges of things that do not fit, quietly burying the errors in geography and the lives that occupied them. Some maps contain intentional silences, areas where the ink simply stops, as if the cartographer ran out of breath. The 14th kilometer is one of those silences, a stretch of Siberian taiga that was officially unmade by the state before the forest could finish the job. The rail spur was a thin, rusted vein of iron cutting through the dense timber of the Yakutsk region, long abandoned by the Ministry of Transport. In the autumn of 1991, as the old structures of the world were being dismantled, a small decommissioning crew was tasked with surveying the line for scrap. They moved slowly through the overgrowth, their handcar creaking over sleepers that had rotted into the black earth. The air was thick with the scent of damp pine and the heavy, metallic smell of old frost. By the time they reached the marker designated as the 14th kilometer, the tracks had almost entirely disappeared beneath a capit of moss and fallen needles. The forest here felt older and more crowded, the trees leaning inward as if to reclaim the narrow path carved out decades before. A low, persistent fog clung to the ground, obscuring the iron rails and making every step feel like an intrusion into a private, silent space. The crew stopped when the lead surveyor noticed a structure that appeared on no modern topographical chart. It was a small telegraph station, a squat building of gray concrete and timber that seemed to have grown directly out of the permafrost. The windows were intact, but opaque, with decades of grime, reflecting nothing but the gray sky and the skeletal branches of the surrounding birches. No path led to the door, and the heavy iron handle was frozen in place by a thick crust of orange rust. It sat in a pocket of absolute stillness, untouched by the winds that hissed through the upper canopy of the forest. When the door finally groaned open, the air that drifted out was stale, carrying with it the sharp ozone tang of old electrical equipment. Inside, the room felt like a frozen snapshot of 1954 dust motes drifting gently through the thin shafts of light that managed to slip past the cloudy window panes. A heavy bakelite telephone rested on a scarred wooden desk beside a stack of untouched logbooks. And the silence. The silence was different from the quiet of the woods outside. It was the stillness of a place where someone had stepped out and never returned. On the main desk, weighted down by a brass compass, was a thick sheaf of yellowed telegrams that had never been filed or forwarded. The paper was brittle, cracking at the edges as the surveyor carefully lifted the first page to the light. Each sheet was covered in neat, typed columns of random 5-digit numbers, a common cipher for secure state communications of the era. However, scrawled in the margins of every single page in frantic, looping handwriting was the same warning: ground is unstable, hold all departures. The surveyor moved to the back of the station, where a large, hand-drawn map of the local sector was pinned to the wall. The map showed the rail line as a straight, confident stroke of red ink, but around the 14th kilometer, the red line began to wobble and fracture into dozens of dotted paths. Small, handwritten notes in the same frantic script were clustered around a specific coordinates box, labeled simply as the sink. There was no geological record of any sinkholes or seismic instability in the Yakutsk archives for that decade. A narrow staircase led down into a basement that should have been a storage room for batteries and coal. And yet, as the crew descended with their lanterns, their light slowly spread across the space, revealing rows upon rows of sturdy wooden crates stacked neatly from floor to ceiling. The wood was remarkably well preserved by the cold, the grain standing out in sharp relief beneath the flickering yellow glow. Each crate was nailed shut with heavy iron spikes, and a thick layer of fine gray dust rested over the tops like a quiet shroud. As they moved closer, the crew realized that every crate bore a hand-stenciled name in black Cyrillic ink. These were not the names of equipment manufacturers or government departments, but the names of individuals. Petrov AV read one, Ivanov SN read another. The names matched the list of station staff and maintenance engineers who had been assigned to this sector in the early 50s, men whose service records ended abruptly without explanation. One of the workers used a crowbar to pry the lid off the nearest crate, expecting to find personal effects, or perhaps classified documents. Instead, the wood gave way with a wet, heavy thud to reveal hundreds of pounds of dense, dark soil. It was local earth, packed so tightly into the box that it had kept the shape of the crate, even after the lid was removed. There was nothing else inside, no clothing, no bones, only the cold, damp smell of the Siberian forest floor. They opened a second crate, and then a third, finding the same result in each one: earth, labeled with a name. The soil was moist to the touch, as if it had been dug from the ground only hours before, despite being sealed away for nearly 40 years. There was no sign of struggle in the basement, no evidence of violence, only the methodical, rhythmic packing of the land into boxes. And slowly, the air in the cellar began to feel heavy, the oxygen seeming thin and difficult to draw into their lungs. Back upstairs, the lead surveyor found the station's master logbook tucked into a hidden drawer beneath the telegraph key. The entries were routine for years, detailing weather patterns and the passage of freight trains carrying timber and ore. Then, in November of 1954, the handwriting changed, becoming the erratic script seen on the telegrams. The logs began to describe geographic drift, claiming that the distance between the 13th and 14th kilometer markers was increasing by several meters every night. The final entry was dated December 12, 1954, written in a hand so unsteady it was nearly impossible to read. It said that the station was no longer resting on solid rock, but was adrift on a sea of moving silt. The writer explained that the trees were drawing closer to the windows every hour, and that the horizon itself had begun to tilt at an angle no world should hold. There was no mention of an evacuation order, only a last, quiet, chilling line: "We are becoming the floor." Leaving the station behind, the crew followed the rusted tracks, further into the forest, toward the point where the line was supposed to terminate. The fog grew thicker, a wall of white that swallowed the sound of their boots on the gravel. After only a few hundred yards, the tracks simply ended, not at a station or a buffer, but at the mouth of a massive, collapsed tunnel. The entrance was choked with the same dark, moist soil found in the crates, as if the mountain had breathed out and filled the void. There was no record of a tunnel ever being constructed at the 14th kilometer. The official maps showed the line as a coastal loop, drifting quietly along the edge of the land, avoiding the highland ridges entirely. Yet here was a feat of engineering, a stone-reinforced bore that had been swallowed whole by the earth. A single rusted lantern hung from a hook near the entrance, its glass cracked, its wick still dry. And it swayed gently in a wind the crew could not feel, a slow, rhythmic, metallic clicking that echoed softly against the silent trees. The surveyor checked his compass, but the needle was spinning in slow, lazy circles, unable to find a true north in the heart of the woods. He looked back toward the telegraph station, but the building was already lost in the mist, its gray silhouette dissolved into the forest. The sense of isolation was absolute, a heavy realization that they were standing on a piece of geography that the rest of the world had agreed to forget. Every detail of the station suggested a disaster that was both quiet and total. As they prepared to head back, one of the workers noticed a series of depressions in the moss near the tunnel entrance. They were shaped like footprints, but they were far too deep, as if whoever had made them had been carrying an impossible weight. The tracks led directly into the wall of soil that blocked the tunnel, vanishing into the earth without a sign of return. There was no evidence of a struggle, only a purposeful march into the darkness of the mountain. The crew retreated to their handcar, the rhythmic clacking of the wheels on the rusted rails sounding like a countdown in the oppressive silence. They did not speak until they had passed the 10th kilometer, and the forest began to thin, letting in the pale, weak light of the afternoon sun. Behind them, the 14th kilometer remained a smudge on the horizon, a place where the ground refused to stay still, and the maps were rewritten in soil. The mystery of the station staff remained packed in crates, waiting under the floorboards. The decommissioned line back to the main junction felt longer than the journey in, the rusted handcar vibrating with a new unsettling frequency. Every few kilometers, the lead surveyor would glance at the crates of soil they had taken as evidence, watching the dark earth settle into the corners of the wood. The forest seemed to watch them back, the birches standing like pale, thin sentries against the encroaching dusk. No one spoke, the air between them thick with the unanswered questions of the 14th kilometer and the men who had been catalogued as dirt. Upon returning to the regional administrative center, the crew found that the atmosphere of the town had shifted with the news of their discovery. The local records clerk, a man who had survived 4 decades of shifting regimes, turned visibly pale when the coordinates of the telegraph station were mentioned. He claimed that the 14th kilometer had been written out of the regional ledger during a 1960 audit for reasons of topographical correction. There were no death certificates for the staff, no pension records, and no military reports of a disaster. They had simply ceased to be a part of the state's inventory. Determined to find a logical explanation, the surveyor spent the following days in the municipal archives, moving quietly through declassified seismic reports from the mid-50s. In the dim light, he uncovered a single hand-annotated map, a relic from a failed mining expedition, suggesting that the area rested atop a massive underground network of limestone fissures. The notes whispered of fissures prone to liquefaction events during heavy thaws, moments when the ground itself could, in theory, behave like a fluid. It was a plausible geological theory, steady, sensible, yet it offered no answer to the lingering mystery: why the telegraph station remained perfectly level while the men inside claimed the world was tilting. The mystery deepened when a retired rail engineer approached the surveyor in a dimly lit tavern, clutching a faded photograph from his youth. The image showed the 14th kilometer station in its prime, with 5 men standing proudly in front of the telegraph room. But the background was wrong. In the photo, a massive, jagged ridge dominated the horizon behind the station, a ridge that did not exist on any map and was nowhere to be seen during the 1991 expedition. The engineer whispered that the Quout Mountain didn't disappear. It had merely moved closer, 1 millimeter at a time, until the station was no longer beside it, but inside it. Returning to the site for a second look, the crew found that the fog had intensified, turning the forest into a monochromatic maze of gray and black. The telegraph station was harder to find this time, the tracks leading them to a spot where the rails simply twisted upward into the air, like frozen vines. The concrete building was still there, but it sat several feet lower in the permafrost than it had only 48 hours prior. The door was wedged shut by the rising earth, and the rhythmic clicking from the tunnel mouth had grown louder, echoing through the trees like a heartbeat. They managed to peer through a gap in the station's window and saw that the basement was now completely flooded with that same dark, heavy soil. The crates they had left behind were gone, buried under a fresh influx of earth that seemed to have pressurized from within the walls. On the desk, the logbook they had previously examined was open to a new page, though no one had been inside to turn it. The ink was still wet, a single sentence sprawling across the paper. The weight is equalized. As the sun began to set, casting long, distorted shadows across the clearing, the ground beneath the surveyor's feet gave a sharp, sickening lurch. It wasn't a tremor of the earth, but a slow, grinding slide, as if the entire forest floor were a carpet being pulled toward the collapsed tunnel. The trees at the edge of the clearing groaned softly, their roots snapping with the sound of pistol shots as they tilted inward. Realizing the geographic drift was not a delusion of the past, but an active process of the present, the crew abandoned their equipment and fled toward the 13th kilometer marker. From the safety of the higher ground, they looked back to see the 14th kilometer marker light, a small, battery-operated beacon, submerge slowly into the mist. It did not fall over, it simply sank, vertically, as if the earth had opened a mouth and swallowed it whole. The silence that followed was absolute, a quiet void of sound that seemed to pull at the very air in their lungs. They reached the main line, exhausted, trembling, knowing that by morning, the 14th kilometer would likely be a few dozen meters further from the world they knew. The following weeks brought a cold, bureaucratic silence that was perhaps more unsettling than the shifting earth of the 14th kilometer. The surveyor's official reports were filed with the new regional authorities, but they were met with a blank indifference that felt practiced, as if the missing geography were a known debt the state had no intention of paying. No investigation was launched, and the scrap metal permits for that specific rail spur were revoked overnight without explanation. It became clear that the 14th kilometer was intended to remain a ghost, a glitch in the transition between two eras of power. Despite the warnings, the surveyor could not shake the memory of the soil-filled crates and the names stenciled in black ink. He began to track down the families of the men listed on those boxes, finding them scattered across the vast reaches of the former Soviet Union. In every instance, the story was the same. The telegrams had stopped arriving in the winter of 1954, and the official notification simply stated the men had been reassigned to a project of national importance. There were no bodies to bury, only an absence that had hardened into a quiet, generational grief. One elderly woman, the sister of Petrov, A.V., offered the final piece of the archival puzzle, a letter quietly smuggled out of the sector just weeks before the station went dark. In it, her brother did not speak of radiation or enemies, but of a biological heaviness in the soil itself. He described how the earth around the 14th kilometer seemed to grow denser each day, pulling at their boots, causing the very buildings to groan under an invisible downward pressure. He wrote that they were no longer digging into the earth, but that the earth was rising to meet them, filling every void they tried to create. Driven by a need for closure, the surveyor made one final trek to the coordinates in the spring of 1992 after the heavy Siberian snows had begun to retreat. He traveled light, carrying only a camera and a compass, following the old rail line that had once been his guide. But when he reached the 13th kilometer, he found that the tracks did not continue forward into the forest. They terminated abruptly, at the edge of a massive, perfectly circular lake that had not been there 6 months prior. The water was black and perfectly still, reflecting the skeletal birches like a dark mirror. There was no sign of the telegraph station, no rusted rails, and no tunnel entrance. The entire 14th kilometer had simply vanished beneath the surface. The surveyor walked the perimeter of the new shoreline, his boots sinking slightly into the soft, silty mud that felt unnervingly warm. There was no sound of birds or insects, only the soft lap of the dark water against the roots of the trees that had survived the subsidence. Using a long branch, he probed the edge of the water, hoping to find a submerged roofline or a glint of metal. The branch sank deep into the silt without hitting anything solid, feeling as though it were being pulled downward by a gentle, persistent suction. As he withdrew the wood, he noticed that the surface of the lake was beginning to ripple, not from the wind, but from large, slow bubbles rising from the center. They burst with a faint, muddy hiss, releasing a scent that reminded him of the ozone and damp earth he had smelled inside the station. He sat on a fallen log and watched the sun begin its slow descent, the light turning the water into a sheet of hammered lead. It occurred to him then that the crates in the basement hadn't been a burial ritual, but an attempt at stabilization, a desperate, futile effort by the staff to balance the weight of a world that was sinking. They hadn't been packing the earth to hide it. They had been trying to fill the void before the void filled them. The names on the crates were likely the last desperate accounting of people who knew they were becoming part of the landscape. As the shadows grew long, the surveyor felt a subtle, familiar vibration beneath his seat, a low-frequency hum that seemed to resonate in his very bones. It wasn't a tremor, but a rhythmic pulse, like the sound of a great machine idling deep beneath the permafrost. He looked at his compass, which he had placed on the log beside him, and watched as the needle didn't spin, but pointed straight down, toward the center of the lake. The geography of the 14th kilometer was no longer horizontal. It had become a vertical mystery, descending into the deep silence of the Siberian crust. He took a single photograph of the black water and the empty horizon, knowing that no one would believe the scale of the disappearance. The map would eventually be updated to show a lake, a natural feature of a rugged landscape, and the 14th kilometer would be relegated to a footnote in a forgotten rail manual. The men who lived there, who sent the warnings and packed the soil, were now part of a geological record that no one would ever be able to read. They were the floor, just as the final log entry had predicted. The surveyor turned and began the long walk back to the first kilometer, leaving the silence of the forest behind him. He never returned to the Yakutsk region, and he never spoke of the crates again, realizing that some silences on a map are there for a reason. The Earth has its own ways of settling its accounts, reclaiming the spaces where we try to leave our mark. Sometimes, the ground doesn't just hold our history, it consumes it, grain by grain, until the trail is lost forever. The 14th kilometer remains a ghost in the archives, a coordinate that exists only in the memories of those who saw it before it sank. It is a reminder that the world beneath our feet is not as solid as we choose to believe, and that some places are not meant to be found twice. History is written in ink, but the truth is often buried in the soil. Sometimes, the most terrifying thing about a missing place is not that it's gone, but that it's still there, just deeper than we can reach.